let me just do some full screen. Okay, I'm an economist actually, and I'm working on environmental issues such as agriculture, biodiversity conservation, a little bit of fisheries and so on. And this presentation will be on the role of small-scale farmers actually, how they can contribute to biodiversity conservation. The topic seems to be important for me because it's usually the case that you do biodiversity conservation in protected areas, you concentrate on protected areas only, but then there's a huge potential actually. This is the international literature showing that there's huge potential also for protection of biodiversity conservation or biodiversity in agricultural areas. So how can small-scale farmers contribute to that? Before going into detail, perhaps a little bit of introduction for the agriculture in Turkey. You may know or you may not know, so maybe I thought it may be good to introduce that a little bit. Despite all the intensification since the 1950s that we see in agriculture in Turkey, in most other countries as well, think about Green Revolution, for instance, there's still a lot of small-scale farmers doing agriculture in Turkey. So small-scale farming is still the dominant form of farming actually in Turkey, where almost 80% of farmers, they have small land plots, like smaller than 10 hectares. Average farm size is still about 7 hectares. And the total number of farmers registered in this registration system that we have in Turkey is about 2 million. So think about it, 2 million people, farmers, and then 80% of them are small-scale farmers. So the number is huge actually. Agriculture, as you may know, as you may see in your everyday life in the US or wherever in Turkey, it's been intensifying. So industrial agriculture has been getting more and more attention with the rising levels of pesticide and fertilizer use, mechanization of agriculture, levels of irrigation, like the land irrigated has been expanding. There's different technologies for that as well, but basically the agricultural production through irrigation has been expanding. Now, this has led, luckily for us, perhaps, to increase productivity, expanded agricultural production, but it also meant a lot of traditional low-intensity, small-scale farming practices. Now, it may not be important if you do not think about livelihoods of small-scale farms, or if we do not think about biodiversity conservation. We can think, okay, it's an intensity of agriculture, that's something good. But I mean, this is not on the other hand, we see some problems related with that. Now, before going into detail, how about biodiversity conservation in Turkey? Turkey is very rich, as you may imagine. It is surrounded by 3 hotspots, actually, of the globally 34 biodiversity hotspots in the world. And there are some problems related with how we can conserve this hugely rich biodiversity. Now, some of the problems, as you may see here, is related with agriculture. Some of the reasons that are stated in the literature are agricultural intensification, excessive irrigation, illegal trade of wildlife. Some veterinary drugs can be also very bad for livestock. This is good, but for birds, for instance, it's not good. Diclofenac is one example. Overgrazing, conversion to croplands, erosion, urbanization. This is not our topic today, but this is another very huge topic for biodiversity conservation, of course. Water policies, draining of wetlands, hydroelectricity projects, afforestation. Now you see the red ones, they are actually related with intensive agriculture, intensification of agriculture, right? So here you can see the key biodiversity areas in Turkey. Again, 3 biodiversity hotspots are surrounding, and Turkey is covering some land in these biodiversity hotspots in terms of Caucasus, Iran, Anatolian, Mediterranean. These are the 3 very important, globally very important biodiversity hotspots where Turkey is located in and surrounded with. So what can small-scale farmers do here in this context? What are they already doing? Now, we know intensive agriculture, again, there's huge literature on that, saying that basically common farmland bird species, but not only bird species, but others as well, like reptiles and like mammals and other insects and so on. There's a huge biodiversity crisis overall, globally, but also in intensive agricultural, the land under intensive agriculture, they have been, these bird species and reptiles and others have been declining. For instance, for Europe, we know that it has declined for the last 30, 40 years by almost 60% in the US, again, coinciding with intensification of agriculture. it fell down by 74%. So it's huge numbers that this biodiversity crisis is actually demonstrating. Now, a strand of literature which is not very much known perhaps for the audience here in Turkey, also for maybe not so much for other countries, is that traditional excessive agriculture, traditional done by small-scale farmers, it's good for many of these species who are using farmland as their habitat. So they, because they provide them with resources they may be lacking. And whenever this farmland is diversified, whenever these are small plots of land, this is also much better for biodiversity conservation. So there are several research teams doing from Germany and from other countries. They are doing research on that. Now, there's not much literature, though, on this. So there could be actually, there are several, two that I could identify, very important ones done by biologists and ecologists mainly, but not that I could identify in social sciences. But overall, the number of scientific studies on this issue are limited in Turkey, unfortunately. One study that was very important for my study, at least, it was comparing organic versus conventional olive production in Kaz Dağları, Ida Mountains of Turkey. And this study this is not published yet, it was a TÜBİTAK project, actually. You can see the reporting in the internet if you're interested. So biodiversity, they show that biodiversity was improved in farmland where there's no herbicide use, like the glyphosate and Roundup things that you may know, and wherever there's no or less tillage. Okay, so regardless of what kind of agriculture you're doing, if you just do not use much herbicide, do not use tillage too much, then biodiversity is higher. This is one study that I could identify, a very comprehensive, important one. There's another one which again was studying this interaction between biodiversity and agricultural production. That found, perhaps not surprisingly, whenever the agricultural landscape is diversified, so whenever this heterogeneity is much more, this benefits, this was a study specifically on mammals, this benefits the diversity of mammals in Sparta. Okay, so these are again not social science studies, but very important findings still for Turkey, at least, that I could identify so far. Now, what I'm going to do here is basically adopting a social sciences perspective and methodology. I'm going to show you what I could find regarding the role of low-intensity small-scale farmers for biodiversity conservation in Turkey, and what kind of direct and indirect effects are there that the small-scale farmers can contribute to for protection of biodiversity. And this is I'm going to do based on in-depth interviews. So with key stakeholders. So the key stakeholders I'm going to show you in a minute. I have basically conducted semi-structured in-depth interviews with representatives from conservation organizations, conservation scientists, as well as farmer associations. So a total of 12 stakeholders I did interview. And I basically tried to reach the key stakeholders there, not every one of them, of course, but I tried to optimize with respect to the diversity of different viewpoints here with regards to wildlife and agriculture in Turkey. I have also analyzed scientific and gray literature on that. Of course, as I said, I mean, in the Turkish literature, in the Turkish scientific literature, there was not much on that, but I could identify several very important reports that I'm going to talk about today. What I did is basically official web pages of conservation organizations, some reports I have also reviewed. I have also reviewed the search engines in academic, the academic and general search engines using wildlife and agriculture, wildlife and farming, and so on, the keywords in English and in Turkish, so that I did not miss important things, I hope. And then the data that I gathered, the qualitative data that I gathered, I analyzed via open coding methods so that I could organize the main ideas and the main effects that I could find in the literature, as well as based on the interviews. Now, results. Basically, this is important. I mean, this hasn't been shown much for Turkey. This has been quite established for the international literature. But what I could also see in line with international literature was that there's actually huge potential how small-scale, low-intensity farmers can contribute to Of course, not all small-scale farmers can contribute to biodiversity conservation, but at least the extensive farming practices that they adopt, they help biodiversity a lot. For instance, here you see the bird species toy in Turkish, Otis tarda, which is quite important and quite important species also on the IUCN Red List. It is globally threatened bird species, which is finding habitats in agricultural land. So basically, if the small-scale farmers do some sort of extensive, not intensive, but extensive small-scale farming, they can create habitat for wildlife. So, for instance, in the case of dry agricultural practices, sustainable managed pastures, and so on, you can basically benefit these bird species, which is called the great bustard toy. The other one, the little bustard, is called in Turkish mezgeldek, tetrax. So, I mean, there are important species that benefit from this kind of agriculture, actually. Now, another direct effect is that the farmland is usually more diversified. You can, for instance, see things like landscape features like natural irrigation ponds, stone walls in this kind of extensive agriculture. Some margins of the farmland are not cultivated, so there are also some forest patches usually wherever you see, wherever you visit some of these extensive agriculture examples in Turkey. I'm going to show you some pictures of that from Izmir. They do support wildlife. So this is also another international literature confirming this, but this is also kind of in line with my findings based on the interviews and the literature review. The third direct effect that I could identify was that the diversity is not only with respect to the farmland heterogeneous farmland features, but it's also basically based on what you raise, what you grow. So cultivated species are diversified. Timing of cultivation is usually also diversified in that kind of small scale, low intensity, extensive farming, traditional farming, if you wish. And this is also contributing to the complexity, to the heterogeneity, if you wish, of the agricultural ecosystems, which in turn benefit wildlife. Okay. Coming to the indirect effects that I could come up with two. First, the chemical input use like pesticides and herbicides and so on are usually lower. This is, of course, not the rule. I mean, you can find many small-scale farmers who use a lot of pesticides and herbicides. But usually, if it is like a traditional extensive agriculture type of agricultural practice, then you usually see that the chemical input use is much lower. And irrigation is also, use of irrigation is also usually limited, which helps to preserve wetlands, which are very important for many of the mammals and bird species, reptiles, insects, and so on. So here on the left-hand side, you see a photo that I took from, one of my students took it, I think, natural irrigation pond in Gödence Seferihisar in Izmir. So it is quite important. I mean, irrigation is done. This is, again, an extensive farming practice, traditional farming practice. This is a very natural pond, so you don't have any cement underneath or anything. It is just the rainwater that fills this pond, and that is later used for irrigation purposes. So if you visit this site now, even now, with all this drought that we are experiencing, it is still there's still water in it, so that they can use it. The farmer there in Gödence, they can use it for irrigation without any other type of groundwater use and so on. Or drainage of wetland, they can do it. And on the right-hand side, you can see how excessive herbicide use in Kaz Dağları in Ide Mountains looks like, right? So if you use these herbicides like glyphosate and so on, which are killing the herbs, the land looks like this, very dry, like that almost, right? So it is quite bad if you do it in this may be a small-scale farmer or not. If you do use a lot of herbicides, it's not good for the mammals, it's not good for the birds, it's not good for insects, it's not good for butterflies, as you may imagine. So it's not only this kind of small-scale versus large-scale, but it's also what you do whenever you're a small-scale farmer. Now, there's a very important term in the literature, in many of the reports, in the European Parliament, in the European Commission, many people talk about this. But this is not very much known in Turkey, as far as I can see. There are some reports, like the one by Redman and Hemami in 2008, which have identified that this term is important for Turkey as it is important for the EU and other countries. This is called high nature value farming. So three most important elements with regards to high nature value farming is that you use your land with based on a low intensity, so low intensity land use. Semi-natural vegetation is still there. So it's not natural, it's not very industrial type of vegetation, like the monoculture type of thing, but it's a semi-natural vegetation where you have some trees, you have a pond, hedgerows, and so on. And third element is the diversity of the land, right? Heterogeneity. So these three features of land are often the very dominant or often, let's say, part of the traditional extensive agriculture in Turkey. So low intensity systems, they contribute to a complex relationship between the nature and the agricultural practice. And these type of practices, they can maintain important habitats, right? So hedgerows, ponds, and trees, forest patches, and so on, they are good for the biodiversity. And they are part of the, as I said, small-scale farming in some parts of Turkey. And traditionally, this is kind of the culture, if you wish, the traditional way of doing farming in Turkey. We have the saying, the phrase, kurda kuşa aşa in Turkish, so for the worm, for the bird, whenever you're sowing seeds, right? In Turkey, in Anatolia, this was traditionally the saying, basically, kurda kuşa aşa. So it's not only for ourselves, it's also good for the worm. They should get their part too for the bird species, and this will be also good for our food. So kurda kuşa aşa, this demonstrates somehow the coexistence that people had in mind, the traditional farming practices or the farmers they had in mind in the past. Now, this is kind of still there, but of course, all these intensifications, socioeconomic policies and so on, they are also partially eroding this kind of mentality, unfortunately. So this report, Buğday Derneği and other, the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, I think at that time, they all contributed, and several other very important civil society organizations working on biodiversity conservation, they contributed to this report by Redman and Himami in 2008. They could actually estimate that that kind of high value nature farming, or if you wish, low intensity, traditional, extensive farming in Turkey was covering almost 50% of the total agricultural areas in Turkey. So it's a huge number. If you think in 2008, almost half of the agricultural land was kind of done by this kind of low intensity farming. But of course, since 2008, things have changed a lot more, like intensification. And if you think again about the other agricultural practices, so this potential seems to be because of land fragmentation, economic development, or the rural to urban migration, where the rural areas are abundant, so the farmers do not want to live there anymore. Okay, all those things have contributed to that kind of loss of traditional extensive agriculture in Turkey, unfortunately. But the authors, the report, they were still saying there many more studies are needed to identify how much it has been lost, how much it is still there, whether it is still the kind of the ideal traditional way of doing agriculture. So, I mean, there are many questions that can be asked both by social scientists as well as natural scientists, actually, that needs to be, I mean, tremendous work, scientific studies can be done on that, but we are just at the beginning of it, I think. So high value nature agriculture, as I told you, this report, again, by Buğday Derneği, Ministry and other very important conservation organizations, they have estimated, as I said, 50% of the agricultural land may be still done kind of in line with high nature value agriculture in Turkey. And these are the areas that they estimated these can be the areas where you can find some sort of extensive traditional agriculture still in Turkey. So as you see, I mean, it's perhaps in the Marmara region, it's not very much, but as you see in the eastern and southern eastern regions and some Black Sea and so on, it's still there usually. I mean, in 2008, it was still there according to their estimations. And all this kind of high nature value agriculture is actually also supporting biodiversity at that time. Now, we don't know what has happened since then. I did not come across with any similar reports then after 2008, but it should be done actually. Some sort of estimation again after 15 years could be very helpful actually. So this is not kind of the expertise that I have, but my expertise is basically talking to people as a social scientist, as an economist, and seeing what kind of policies could, for instance, promote this kind of agriculture, what kind of direct and indirect effects are there, and so on. So this high nature value agriculture is basically, this is again the same report that I have shown you actually, that I have mentioned. This is all these red areas that you see here in Turkey. These are because in some of them, there's some sort of extensive crop production. In some others, there's extensive livestock production, and there may be also overlaps, but also in some of them, forest farming, extensive forest farming is done. For instance, the idea of going to yaylas for extensive sort of mountain pastoralism, if you wish, is still there, right? It's not, I mean, perhaps not as much as in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, but it's still there. I mean, we still hear about that kind of livestock production, perhaps, for instance. Usually you also get some sort of crop rotation, and then you have also livestock raising together and so on. So mixed farming is very important still. I cannot say whether it is still dominant, but it's still there in many places of Anatolia. Okay, as a conclusion, I have shown you the direct and indirect effects and how it is contributing, how small-scale farmers are actually contributing to biodiversity conservation, even though we usually concentrate on protected areas whenever we talk about environmental conservation, nature conservation, doğa koruma in Turkish, right? So we think about milli parklar, national parks, we think about protected areas. They are important, but they're a small percentage of the whole area of Turkey, right? But we have a lot more with regards to agricultural production. Agricultural area is also quite big in Turkey. And at least 50, or not at least, but I mean, an important part of this is still done by small-scale farmers, low intensity, and this is in line with some biodiversity targets, actually. So there should be many more studies kind of trying to figure out which type of policies could support this, which type of, I mean, there's also a huge need for the identification and scientific documentation of these kind of different traditional extensive agricultural practices, which are supporting biodiversity in Turkey. And also, of course, as an economist, I should also underline that economic incentives like those provided in the EU, for instance, for European farmers, agri-environment schemes within agri-environment schemes, this kind of economic incentives for those farmers who are benefiting from biodiversity should be somehow enacted in Turkey as well. There have been some sort of policy experiments in the past, but they have stopped mainly. And the prospect of becoming a member of the EU was also contributing to that in the past. Now we don't know how it's going to continue. But anyhow, I mean, creating markets, another thing, very important again, for that kind of particularly important biodiversity benefiting type of practice, agricultural practice, small-scale practice, could be also useful, very useful. For promoting that kind of biodiversity friendly or wildlife friendly agriculture that is usually done by small scale farmers. Okay, and again, as I mentioned, we need to have some sort of socioeconomic and agricultural policies that need to support small scale farmers. So in terms of their livelihood, in terms of incentives, perhaps for reversing this kind of rural urban migration could be also very helpful. And as I said, this kind of agri-environment schemes could be established in Turkey as well in order to raise the incomes of small-scale farms at the same time as supporting biodiversity conservation, certain species which are important for farmland. Okay, thank you very much. This was it from me.